Woodstock made legends. The Who smashing guitars. Hendrix playing the national anthem at dawn to a half-empty field. Janis Joplin screaming her heart out. But here's what most people don't know. The Grateful Dead played one of the worst sets of their entire career that night. And it wasn't just bad luck or an off night. Woodstock exposed something fundamental about who the Dead were and what they'd spent 4 years building since the acid tests. It was the wrong stage, the wrong crowd, the wrong entire concept for a band that had trained themselves to do something completely different. And the crazy part? That disaster in August of 1969 didn't hurt them. It clarified everything. Within months, they'd completely reject what Woodstock represented and double down on building their own thing. No film release, no soundtrack, no playing the game everyone else played. They walked away from the mythology machine and built something bigger. So what actually happened on that muddy stage in August 1969? And why did it take the Dead another 2 decades to admit just how badly they'd screwed it up? Let's start with the acid tests, because you can't understand Woodstock without understanding where the Dead came from. December 1965. The Warlocks show up to Ken Kesey's public acid test in San Jose. Phil Lesh later said they didn't even bring instruments that first time. They just wanted to feel it out. But once they got it completely. The pranksters handed them instruments. Neil Cassidy and Allen Ginsberg rapped into tape machines, and the band just played. No set list, no stage, no separation between performer and audience. Ken Babbs remembered people jamming until dawn, and the whole point was that nobody knew who was supposed to be entertaining who. That became the Dead's training ground. Not 3-minute radio hits, not tight festival sets. They learned to improvise for hours in an environment where the music could stop and start, where they might play or they might not, where the audience was dosed and participatory, and the whole thing was fluid. They weren't performing at people, they were creating something with people. By the time they changed their name from the Warlocks to the Grateful Dead, Jerry found it in an old dictionary at Phil's house, they'd internalized that approach completely. And it kept not working at traditional festivals. Monterey Pop in '67, they flopped. Garcia later joked they had a tradition of blowing the big ones. The Dead weren't built for showcase performances. They were built for the long haul, the multi-night run, the space where things could develop over hours and show. Which brings us to Woodstock, August 16th, 1969, Saturday night. The Dead were supposed to go on in the evening, but nothing at Woodstock ran on time. It had rained, the stage was soaked, and bare. Owsley Stanley, their legendary sound man and acid chemist, had spent 2 hours rewiring the stage grounding because he thought the Hanley PA system was inadequate. Bob Weir tells the story best. He's playing St. Stephen, and every time he touches his guitar, he's getting shocked. Not little static pops, actual electrical shocks. Then, during one passage, he hits the strings, and a great big blue spark arcs out and literally lifts him off his feet, sends him back 8 feet. You can hear it on the soundboard tape if you know what you're listening for. St. Stephen just abruptly cuts into Mama Tried because Weir got knocked backwards and they had to reset. Bear later explained what happened. The stage grounding was wrong, so he changed it. But in changing it, he accidentally turned the entire stage into an antenna for the helicopter radio frequencies. Phil's bass was picking up helicopter radio. The stage itself was electrified. And to make it worse, the revolving cookie stage, this mechanical platform that was supposed to let one band set up while another played, had collapsed under the weight of the Dead's heavy equipment. So they'd had to set everything up again while the crowd waited. Ken Babbs, who was there with the pranksters, remembered the microphones weren't even working at first. He had to tell stories to fill the delays while they got the system running. The whole thing was chaos. But here's the thing, chaos wasn't the problem. The Dead had played through chaos 1,000 times. The acid tests were chaos. Half their best shows came out of near disasters where something broke and they had to improvise their way through it. The problem wasn't the electrical shocks or the rain or the delayed start. The problem was the format itself. Woodstock was a spectacle, a one-shot, everybody gets their moment, play your hits and get off kind of event. The crowd, 500,000 people, wasn't there for the Grateful Dead specifically. They were there for Woodstock, for the event, for the mythology. And by the time the Dead went on after midnight, most of those people were exhausted, coming down. The Dead played Dark Star. Of course they played Dark Star. Robert Hunter's cosmic lyrics over Garcia's guitar, long, exploratory improvisational jams that could go anywhere. But at Woodstock, with a sleeping crowd and a one-shot performance, it just meandered. The same song they'd captured on Live Dead, one of the greatest live albums ever recorded, fell flat. There was no night two to build on what worked. No familiar heads in the front who knew when to lean in. Just a vast dark field of strangers waiting for it to be over so Creedence could go on. They opened with St. Stephen, which got cut short by the shocks. Threw in Mama Tried to reset, then a false start on High Time before finally getting into Dark Star proper. The set wandered through nearly 90 minutes of music that never quite caught fire. You can hear it on the soundboard. There are moments, sure, but mostly it's a band fighting their equipment and the environment and the whole wrong energy of the situation. And that's where it gets interesting, because John Fogerty was pissed. Creedence Clearwater Revival was supposed to go on earlier, but everything ran late. And by the time the Dead finally wrapped up their set, including a long Turn on Your Love Light with Pigpen rapping for what felt like forever, it was past midnight. Fogerty said the Dead were high on LSD and played too long, and by the time CCR came on, everybody was just laying there asleep. He felt like the Dead had sabotaged Creedence's moment in the spotlight. Was he right? Probably not fair to say they sabotaged anything, but he wasn't wrong about the timing. The Dead did play long, they did meander, and they probably were dosed. But that's how they played every show. The difference was that at their own shows, that's what people came for. At Woodstock, it was a mismatch. The Dead knew it too. Bob Weir later called it probably the worst set we've ever performed. Jerry Garcia, appearing on Letterman in 1987 during the In the Dark boom, laughed about it. He said, "We usually do pretty bad on the big ones. We played terrible at Woodstock and Monterey Pop Festival." And then he and Weir joked about the electric shocks because by then it was funny. By then, they'd built an empire doing things their own way, and Woodstock was just this weird footnote. But in '69, it wasn't funny yet. It was embarrassing. The biggest cultural event of the decade, the moment that supposedly defined a generation. And the Grateful Dead, who should have been the perfect band for it, who embodied the whole psychedelic communal vibe more than almost anyone, completely bombed. So they did something radical. They refused to be in the Woodstock film. The band refused. Creedence refused. But the Dead's reason was partly because the film crew, led by director Michael Wadley, found the footage basically unusable. The lighting was so low, so dark that you could barely see them. Even if they'd wanted to salvage it, the footage didn't work. They also refused to be on the soundtrack. No film, no soundtrack, no participating in the mythology machine that made The Who and Hendrix and Santana even bigger stars. The Dead just walked away from it. The decision clarified everything. Woodstock was supposed to prove you could build a youth culture around big, spectacular one-time events. The Dead proved the opposite. They proved you could build something bigger by rejecting that entire model. Look what they did after Woodstock. They didn't chase bigger festivals or try to fix their big show problem. They doubled down on touring, on building a community of tape traders and heads who followed them from city to city. They played multiple night runs where the real magic happened on night 3 after everyone had settled in. They encouraged people to record their shows, tolerated it at first, then actively supported it, because they understood that the music wasn't the product, the experience was the product, the community was the product. They built something Woodstock could never capture, continuity. A show on Tuesday informed Wednesday's show. A fall tour built on what worked in the spring. Heads brought their knowledge of the repertoire. knew the difference between a transcendent playing in the band and a merely good one. That kind of relationship doesn't happen in a 90-minute festival slot at 2 in the morning. By 1973, just 4 years after Woodstock, they played 600,000 people, bigger than Woodstock. And this time it worked. Why? Because it was the Dead's kind of event. Bill Graham helped organize it. Multi-day, community-focused, the right kind of crowd. The soundcheck jam on July 27th is legendary. Garcia, Weir, Lesh, Kreutzmann, Mickey Hart, all of them locked in. The actual show on the 28th is considered one of their great performances. Same band, bigger crowd, completely different result, because the conditions matched what they'd built. That's the thing Woodstock taught them, or maybe it didn't teach them anything. Maybe they already knew it and Woodstock just confirmed it. You can't reduce what the Grateful Dead did to a single performance. You can't capture it in a 90-minute festival slot at 2 a.m. for a crowd that's half asleep. Their whole thing, the improvisation, the jamming, the building night after night, the relationship with an audience that knew the repertoire and could follow where they were going, none of that translated to Woodstock's format. Bear understood this. In his recollections about Woodstock, he didn't just blame the technical problems. He said, Woodstock was a disaster because the wrong sort of people tried to control it. He meant the festival organizers, the corporate types, the people who wanted to package the counterculture and sell it back as spectacle. The Dead had spent 4 years building something that couldn't be packaged. The acid tests weren't spectacles, they were happenings. Participatory, fluid, unpredictable. Woodstock tried to turn happening into spectacle, and for most bands that worked fine. But for the Dead, it exposed the fundamental incompatibility between what they were doing and what the mainstream music industry wanted from them. So they spent the next 3 decades proving you didn't need that industry. They built the most successful touring operation in rock history without radio hits, without MTV, without playing the game. Deadheads didn't just buy tickets, they organized their lives around tour. They traded tapes with obsessive detail, could tell you which China Cat Sunflower from which year had the best transition into I Know You Rider, followed the band from city to city because you couldn't get what they offered from a single show. That whole ecosystem, the one that eventually grossed more than almost any other touring act, that created a subculture so robust it's still going with Dead and Company. That didn't come from Woodstock's success. It came from Woodstock failure. It came from the Dead looking at what happened on that muddy stage in August '69 and saying, yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing our own thing. Which is why, decades later, when Garcia and Weir went on Letterman and laughed about playing terrible at Woodstock, they weren't bitter. They'd won. Not by being in the Woodstock film or on the soundtrack, or by becoming the next big arena rock act. They'd won by realizing that Woodstock's definition of success, the big moment, the spectacle, the mainstream validation, wasn't their definition. Bob Weir got shocked so hard it knocked him backwards. The stage turned into a radio antenna. Half the crowd was asleep. They played one of the worst sets of their career at the most famous festival in history. And by walking away from that entire model, by refusing to participate in the mythology, they built something that outlasted almost everyone who did participate. Woodstock made legends, but the Grateful Dead became something weirder and bigger than a legend. They became a way of life. That's why Woodstock was the wrong stage for the Grateful Dead. Not because they played badly, though they did, but because the entire concept of what Woodstock was selling didn't match what the Dead were building. They needed the multi-night run, the participatory audience, the freedom to meander and explore and fail and try again the next night. They needed room to be a happening, not a spectacle. By rejecting Woodstock's model, they proved there was another path. You didn't have to play the game. You didn't have to chase the big festival moment, or the movie, or the mainstream validation. You could build your own ecosystem, cultivate your own audience, and create something sustainable that would outlast the spectacle. 50 years later, we remember Woodstock as a cultural touchstone, but how many people actually listened to the Woodstock performances? How many put on the Who's set or Santana's set and really dig in? Deadheads listen to shows from '69 all the time. Not Woodstock. That one's kind of a curiosity, a footnote, something you check out once to hear how bad it was. But the Fillmore runs, the Avalon shows, the small venues where they were building what would become the whole Dead thing, those tapes get traded and analyzed and loved. Because Woodstock was about the event. The Dead were about the music. And when those two things collided on a muddy stage in the middle of the night with electrical shocks and a sleeping crowd and a grinding sense that this just wasn't working, it exposed the difference. Some bands are built for the big moment. The Dead were built for the long haul. Woodstock tried to make them something they weren't, and by refusing to play along, they became exactly what they were always meant to be.